What happens when a ruthless gang targets an aging war veteran and his loyal dog, thinking his quiet life makes him an easy target, only to realize he's a retired U.S. Army sniper with a deadly past? Watch as Jack Pierce and his dog, Max, fight back against the gang, uncovering a hidden network of corruption that has been silently tearing their community apart. Together, they'll expose the truth and take down a system built on fear and violence. The morning mist hung low over the suburban park, its light gray tendrils drifting lazily between the trees. The quiet hum of the world waking up felt almost peaceful, if only for a moment. The gentle chirp of birds, the soft rustling of leaves as joggers passed by, and the laughter of children playing in the distance created a backdrop of calm serenity. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting fleeting patches of warmth onto the winding trail. For Jack Crawford, it was a sanctuary. Jack, a tall man with a solid build, walked at a measured pace, his German shepherd, Max, walking silently by his side. The dog's ears were alert, yet calm, his sleek coat catching the sunlight. Max was more than just a companion to Jack. He was a protector, a bond forged through years of shared experience and training. Jack's hand rested lightly on the leash, feeling the steady rhythm of Max's steps. Their morning walks had become more than routine. They were a quiet moment of peace in a world that often felt chaotic. Max's nose twitched as they passed a patch of grass, a squirrel's fleeting scent still fresh in the air. Jack's mind wandered as he took in the surroundings, lost for a moment in the simplicity of it all. These walks allowed him to escape, even for a brief time, from the dark corners of his past. The days following his retirement from the Army had been difficult, but these quiet mornings allowed him to regain a sense of peace. As they rounded a gentle bend in the path, Jack's eyes caught a small group of men gathered near a bench under the shade of an old oak tree. They lounged with an air of arrogance, laughing loudly, their voices discordant against the otherwise serene backdrop of the park. One of the men, a burly figure with a leather jacket slung lazily over his shoulder, nudged his companions and pointed in Jack's direction. His words were barely audible, but the laughter that followed was unmistakably mocking. Jack kept his stride steady, his expression carefully neutral. He could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their gaze like a pressure on his back. It was a feeling he knew all too well, the sensation of being sized up, judged. Max's instincts were sharp, and the dog's body tensed slightly, sensing the growing hostility. But Jack gave him a quiet command to stay calm. This wasn't the first time he had encountered people like this, and it wouldn't be the last. One of the men, a wiry figure with tattoos creeping up his neck, stepped forward, breaking the uneasy silence. "Hey, I'm talking to you!" His voice rang out, grating and hostile. Jack slowed his pace, his eyes meeting the man's with an unreadable expression. "Morning," Jack said evenly, his voice betraying no emotion. The man sneered, his lips curling into something that resembled a smirk, though it was filled with malice. "Real nice morning, huh? What's a guy like you doing around here?" He gestured to the park, his tone dripping with disdain. "You don't belong here. This is our spot." The group's laughter intensified, sharp and mocking. Jack's posture remained unchanged, but his mind was already assessing the situation, calculating every possible outcome. Max remained by his side, his body tense, ready to act at a moment's notice. But Jack held him back with a firm, silent command. There was no need to escalate things unless it became unavoidable. One of the others, a thin, wiry man, rose from the bench and spat on the ground, his eyes narrowing as he sized Jack up. "He doesn't look lost. Maybe he's just stupid," he said, his voice filled with contempt. The group shifted subtly, their movements intentional, closing in on Jack as if tightening a noose. The tension in the air became palpable, the laughter growing colder. Jack's eyes never wavered from the man in front of him. "I don't want trouble," Jack said, his voice firm but calm, yet carrying an unmistakable edge. "Just out for a walk." The leader of the group, now stepping closer, the chain of his wallet swinging from his pocket, chuckled darkly, his expression one of utter disdain. "Oh, you don't want trouble? Too bad, because it looks like you just found some," he said, his voice filled with venom. Max gave a low growl, a soft rumble that reverberated through the air. Jack's fingers tightened slightly on the leash, but he didn't move. His mind was calculating, every muscle in his body coiled, ready for the inevitable confrontation. He'd been in worse situations before. He wasn't about to back down now. The leader reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a length of heavy chain, letting it dangle menacingly in the air. The sound of the metal links clinking filled the quiet space between them. "See this?" he asked, his tone dark and threatening. "This is our turf. You either turn around or we'll teach you a lesson you won't forget." The wiry man, now grinning, pulled out a pocket knife, flipping it open with a flourish. The glint of the blade caught the light as he sneered. "Better yet, we'll teach your mud a lesson too." Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. His grip on Max's leash remained steady. The situation was escalating quickly, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the confrontation reached its breaking point. The men were clearly trying to provoke him, but Jack was a professional. He knew how to stay calm, to wait for the right moment. His calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to the growing hostility around him. The gang members began to close in, their confidence rising, but Jack remained still, his mind focused on the movements of each individual. He knew he had the upper hand in this situation. His training was more than enough to handle whatever they threw his way. Max's growl deepened, sending a ripple of unease through the group. The tension in the air was thick now, every breath feeling like a countdown to the inevitable. Jack's eyes never left the leaders, his expression unwavering. The leader of the group sneered, his eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and malice. "You think you're tough?" he taunted, his fingers tightening around the length of chain. He took a step closer, clearly relishing the intimidation. "This is our park, and you're just some stranger thinking he can stroll through like he owns the place." The group closed in further, subtly adjusting their positions to form a loose semicircle around Jack and Max. Their eyes gleamed with menace, and the once serene morning air seemed to crackle with their hostility. The tension had thickened, and Jack could feel it, like the weight of a storm brewing on the horizon. Jack didn't flinch. His hand rested lightly on Max's leash, the dog's muscles tensed beneath his calm exterior. The growl that had come from Max was low but steady, an unmistakable warning. Jack could feel his heartbeat quicken ever so slightly, but outwardly he remained unaffected. His training kicked in, and he evaluated every possible scenario. There were 6 of them, and they were armed, but they were still underestimating him. "You're just out for a walk, huh?" The leader's voice dripped with scorn. "Then why don't you take a step back, turn around, and get the hell out of here before things get ugly?" Max let out another deep, warning growl, his posture rigid. Jack's gaze never wavered from the leaders. He wasn't about to let them bully him, but he also knew that provoking them further could lead to a violent escalation. He needed to defuse the situation. "I said I don't want trouble," Jack repeated, his voice steady and firm. "I'm just walking my dog. If you want to act tough, go ahead, but I'm not going to engage." A murmur passed through the group, and the leader's smirk faltered for a moment. He didn't expect Jack to remain so composed. The wiry man with tattoos sneered and spat on the ground near Jack's feet. "Maybe he's just stupid," he muttered, his voice laced with venom. He rose from the bench, a gleam of hostility in his eyes. "But he's definitely out of place. You really think you can just stroll through our park without facing the consequences?" Jack's eyes didn't shift. His mind worked quickly, assessing the situation. The group was trying to provoke him, to get him to react. If he lost his cool, it would give them the opening they needed. He needed to stay calm. The gang members might be acting tough, but they were clearly looking for a fight they thought they could easily win. Jack's military background told him otherwise. One of the men, the one with the chain, swung the heavy metal links menacingly through the air. He grinned, his eyes narrowing with malicious intent. "We've got a message for guys like you," he sneered, his voice full of mockery. "People like you don't belong here. People like you never have and never will." Max growled again, his body now stiff, ready to act. Jack's grip on the leash tightened, but he didn't move. His stance was calm but alert, like a coiled spring, ready to unleash at a moment's notice. His mind worked through the possible outcomes. He didn't want to fight, but he wasn't afraid to do what was necessary to defend himself. The leader took another step forward, the chain swinging from his hand. "You should have known better than to come through here, old man," he said with a smirk, his tone condescending. "Now you've got to pay the price for thinking you can take a walk in our park." At that moment, Max gave a deep, throaty growl. It wasn't loud, but it was filled with menace, sending a ripple of unease through the gang. The leader's gaze shifted to the dog, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But it was brief, and the leader quickly recovered, his confidence unwavering. Jack took a slow breath, his heart steady, his resolve firm. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice low but filled with an unspoken warning. His words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. He wasn't pleading with them. He was making a statement. The leader's face twisted into a sneer, his hand tightening around the chain. He wasn't going to back down. "Too late for that," he growled, swinging the chain in the air like a weapon. The other members of the group began to close the gap, their movements deliberate as they advanced on Jack, thinking they had him surrounded. Jack didn't flinch. His mind was already running through the moves he would make, anticipating their every action. He didn't need to fight all of them, but he did need to make them understand they had underestimated him. The wiry man with the tattoo stepped forward, his hand reaching for something in his pocket. Jack's eyes flicked to him, his training kicking in, as he noted the glint of a blade emerging from the man's hand. The pocket knife was small but dangerous. Jack's eyes narrowed and his body tensed, ready to react. "You really think you can take us all on?" the wiry man mocked, holding up the knife. "You're outnumbered, old man." Jack's hand flexed on the leash, his fingers tightening as his eyes tracked the movements of each man around him. His thoughts were sharp and precise, calculating the risks and the best course of action. The wiry man was getting closer, the blade gleaming in the sunlight. "I've faced worse odds," Jack said quietly, his voice steady, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the growing hostility around him. His words weren't a boast, they were a warning. He'd been trained for situations like this, and he wasn't about to be intimidated. The wiry man with the knife grinned, taking another step forward, clearly eager to test Jack's resolve. But just as he lunged, Max sprang into action, darting forward with incredible speed. The dog's body was a blur as he slammed into the wiry man, knocking him off balance and sending the knife clattering to the ground. The group froze for a split second, clearly startled by Max's quick reflexes. Jack moved in an instant. He grabbed the wrist of the man closest to him, twisting it sharply until the man yelped in pain. The chain clattered to the ground as the man staggered back, clutching his arm. "You should have walked away," Jack said, his voice cold as he held the man at bay. The leader, his confidence now wavering, glared at him, but Jack wasn't about to let them regain control of the situation. Max stood by his side, a constant, unwavering presence. The dog's growl rumbled in the air, a signal to the gang that Jack wasn't alone, and that they had made a grave mistake. The men staggered back, momentarily thrown off balance by the sudden turn of events. Their leader, face flushed with frustration, shook his head as if trying to reassert control over the situation. He had expected a quick victory, a show of dominance that would leave Jack on the ground, groveling for mercy. Instead, he found himself facing a man who was calm under pressure, someone who knew exactly how to handle a threat. Jack stood tall, his body coiled with readiness, but his movements were slow and deliberate. He had no interest in drawing this out any longer than necessary. His hand remained steady on Max's leash, the dog now standing at his side, his ears alert, his eyes fixed on the group like a predator sizing up its prey. The leader sneered, taking a step back, clearly reconsidering his earlier bravado. "You think you can just walk through here like it's nothing?" he asked, his voice edged with uncertainty now. He had lost his earlier confidence, and it was evident to everyone watching. "I told you," Jack replied, his tone still calm but unwavering. "I'm just out for a walk. But if you want trouble, it's not going to go the way you think." His eyes met the leader's, unwavering, as if daring him to make the next move. Max's low growl rumbled through the air again, his teeth glinting in the sunlight as he kept his focus on the group. The tension was thick, hanging like a storm cloud over them. The leader seemed to weigh his options, his gaze flickering between his men and Jack, then back at the dog. It was clear now that this wasn't a fight they could win, not without risking serious injury. But despite their hesitation, the wiry man with tattoos stepped forward again, his eyes burning with defiance. He reached for something in his jacket pocket, a small, old-fashioned burner phone. As his fingers brushed against the phone, Jack's eyes locked onto it instantly. He had seen that kind of phone before, in situations where people didn't want to be traced, where secrecy was paramount. This wasn't just a random confrontation. These men were part of something bigger. "You've got no idea what you've walked into, old man," the wiry man muttered under his breath, his voice low, but carrying a heavy undertone of threat. He punched something into the phone and brought it up to his ear, his expression darkening as he spoke softly into it. "Yeah, it's all set. Same time tomorrow. No mistakes this time. And make sure the families know they're not welcome here. We don't need any more of them showing up." Jack's gaze sharpened as he processed the conversation. His mind immediately began to race. The mention of families, of a coordinated effort, it all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple gang harassment. This wasn't just about intimidation. It was about driving people out, people who didn't belong, people who were new to the area. The wiry man hung up, his eyes glinting with a mix of malice and arrogance. "You're messing with things you don't understand, old man. We don't need people like you or your kind around here. This place is ours, and we've got the whole neighborhood in our pockets." Jack's heart skipped a beat as the pieces started to fall into place. This was no random act of bullying. These men were systematically pushing out families, targeting those who were new to the area, and instilling fear. They were creating an atmosphere of terror, a calculated campaign designed to drive people into submission. It was a methodical effort to take control of the neighborhood, one family at a time. And that's when Jack knew he couldn't let this go. The situation had escalated beyond just a confrontation with a gang. It was clear now that these men were part of something larger, something that had tentacles reaching into every corner of the neighborhood. But Jack was no stranger to this kind of fight. He had been in the military long enough to know how to dismantle a network piece by piece. Max's growl deepened again, and Jack gave a slight nod, signaling for the dog to stay alert. He turned back to the leader, his voice now carrying an edge of resolve. "You're not going to get away with this. You're terrorizing families, pushing people out of their homes. You think you can just keep doing this without consequences?" The leader's sneer faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure, standing taller. "What are you going to do about it? You and your mutt can't stop us." Jack didn't reply right away. His mind was already working, calculating the next steps. He couldn't let this group operate unchecked, not with the kind of plan they had. It was clear now that they weren't just a bunch of thugs looking to pick a fight. They were organized and they had resources. Jack had seen this before in his time in the army. He had dealt with men who thought they were untouchable, but they never understood that there was always someone out there who was willing to bring them down. He needed information, something that would link this group to the bigger network behind them. Jack's hand went to the burner phone the wiry man had dropped on the ground, and as he reached down to pick it up, the leader made a move. "Leave that," the leader growled, his voice tight with frustration. But Jack was already standing, his hand gripping the phone, his eyes cold and focused. "I don't think so," Jack said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He turned the phone over in his hands, the light reflecting off the cracked screen. There were messages on it, lots of them, all marked with timestamps and addresses, all from unknown numbers. As Jack scrolled through the text messages, his eyes narrowed. "Target confirmed. Same time tomorrow," one message read. Another followed. "Make sure the families know they aren't welcome here. We don't need cops sniffing around. Keep it quiet." Jack's grip tightened on the phone, a cold rage spreading through his chest. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was part of a coordinated campaign to run people out of their homes. It wasn't just about the park. It was about domination, intimidation, and fear. Without a word, Jack tucked the phone into his pocket, his expression grim. He turned to the leader, whose smug look had disappeared. Now the man seemed unsure, his bravado slipping. "You think you're untouchable," Jack said evenly, his voice cutting through the tension. "But you're not. I'm going to make sure this stops. This neighborhood deserves to feel safe again. And I'm going to make sure you regret ever trying to terrorize people like this." The leader's face twisted into something ugly, but Jack didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and began to walk away, Max at his side. The group of men stood there, stunned, not expecting Jack to leave so calmly. But Jack knew better than to let them get the last word. He had work to do, and the moment for action was coming soon. As Jack and Max disappeared around the bend in the park, Jack's mind was already working, thinking about the bigger picture. He couldn't just walk away from this. He had uncovered the tip of the iceberg, and now it was time to dig deeper. As Jack and Max made their way through the park, the peaceful atmosphere that had once seemed so comforting now felt distant. His mind was no longer focused on the calm of the morning or the simple pleasures of walking with his dog. The words he had overheard, the message in those texts, everything was clearer now. This wasn't just a random gang of troublemakers. This was a calculated effort to intimidate, to push out families who didn't belong. Jack had seen these kinds of operations before. He had witnessed networks of fear being built brick by brick, each piece of terror carefully placed to ensure domination. And it sickened him. He wasn't just dealing with a few thugs, he was dealing with something much larger, something that needed to be stopped before it could destroy even more lives. Max trotted alongside him, his tail still held high, but Jack could tell that the dog was just as aware of the shift in the air. Max had always been more than just a companion. He was Jack's constant, his protector, and the bond between them ran deep. Together they had faced countless threats, and Jack trusted Max to be his eyes and ears in moments like these. Max's instincts were always sharp, and Jack needed them now more than ever. As they reached his car, Jack paused, looking out over the park one last time. The breeze was cool, but it did nothing to calm the storm swirling in his chest. His hand rested on the hood of his truck, but his mind was far from the present moment. He needed to find out more about the group, their connections, and who was pulling the strings. The burner phone he had taken from the wiry man with tattoos buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and unlocked the screen, scrolling through the messages once more. One number appeared repeatedly, an untraceable line. Jack wasn't an expert in tech, but he knew enough to understand that the person behind this number was important. It was the key to everything. Before he could delve deeper into the phone, Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the window of his truck. He turned, his eyes narrowing instinctively, expecting another confrontation. But it wasn't one of the gang members. A woman stood outside, her figure framed by the sunlight. A worn leather jacket draped over her shoulders. She had an air of quiet confidence, and there was something about her that made Jack pause. She didn't look like someone who would be intimidated easily. Jack rolled down the window, keeping his eyes on her. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice measured but guarded. She smiled faintly, her eyes sharp and assessing. "I think you already know the answer to that," she replied, her tone casual but purposeful. "Name's Tanya Walker, freelance journalist. You've been making a bit of a name for yourself lately, haven't you?" Jack's brow furrowed. Tanya Walker was no stranger to the kind of investigation he had seen. He had heard of her before. She had a reputation for digging into the kind of networks that most people turned a blind eye to. But he wasn't sure how she had found him. "Look," Tanya continued, glancing around as if ensuring no one was listening. "I've been following the Black Vipers for over a year now. And you?" She paused, her gaze settling on Max, who had started to growl lowly under his breath. "You're the first person to make them bleed." Jack didn't speak immediately, his mind working through the implications of what she was saying. He wasn't one to trust easily, but there was something about the way she spoke that made him think she wasn't just some reporter looking for a story. There was genuine conviction in her eyes. "You're working against the Vipers?" Jack asked, keeping his voice steady. "What do you want from me?" Tanya leaned in slightly, her voice lowering as she spoke. "I've tried to go public with what I've uncovered. Twice. Both times the stories were killed before they even hit the press. These guys have their claws in everything. Politics, law enforcement, local businesses. They're untouchable. I've gathered all the intel I can, but I can't do this alone. I need someone who can take action." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, processing her words. He could tell she wasn't bluffing. The Vipers were deeper entrenched than he had realized, and the message from the gang leader had confirmed it. They were trying to force out entire families, systematically driving people away and making it impossible for them to find peace. "And what exactly do you want me to do?" Jack asked, his voice low and cautious. "You want me to take your intel and be your muscle?" Tanya shook her head. "It's not just that," she said firmly. "I've been gathering names, financial records, connections, all tied to the Vipers. But the thing is, without your help, without someone who can actually do something with it, it's just a pile of paper. I'm not asking you to fight this battle for me. I'm asking you to expose them. I know the kind of work you've done. You've got the skills and you have the drive. We can't let these men run roughshod over the entire neighborhood. If we don't act, it'll only get worse." Jack turned the idea over in his mind. It was tempting, the thought of taking down a network as dangerous as this one. But the risk was high. Going public with this kind of information would have serious consequences. Jack wasn't interested in making a name for himself. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man trying to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. "I don't work with the system," Jack replied flatly. "I left that life behind a while ago." Tanya nodded, as if she had expected this. "I get that, but this isn't about the system. It's about the people who are getting trampled underfoot. People who don't have the luxury of walking away like you did. If we don't step in, they're going to keep coming. You've already seen it." Jack's expression remained unreadable, but her words stuck with him. The families in the neighborhood, the ones who had just moved in, who were just trying to start fresh, they didn't deserve this. "I'll think about it," Jack said, his voice steady. "But don't get your hopes up." Tanya didn't flinch. "I'm used to working alone," she said, "but I'm starting to think that maybe I'm not the only one who's had enough of these guys." With that, she handed him a folder. It was thick, filled with documents and pictures. "Everything I have," she said simply, "and when you're ready, I'll be here." Jack took the folder, his eyes scanning the contents briefly before slipping it into his bag. "We'll see what happens next." As Tanya walked away, Jack climbed into his truck. Max, as always, hopped into the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on Jack. The dog seemed to understand the weight of what was about to happen. Jack started the engine, the roar of the truck filling the air. He had a plan now. He didn't know exactly where it would lead, but he knew he wasn't going to let this network of fear continue to grow unchecked. He had a new mission now, one that would take him into the heart of the Viper's operation. And this time, it wasn't just about surviving, it was about fighting back. Jack drove through the streets, his thoughts focused, each turn and intersection a part of the bigger picture. The folder Tanya had given him rested on the passenger seat, its contents now his primary focus. There was more to this than a mere gang of thugs. These were organized criminals with far-reaching influence. And the more he studied the files, the clearer it became that they weren't just trying to take over a neighborhood, they were building an empire of fear. Max sat quietly in the passenger seat, his ears perked, alert to the world outside. Jack knew the dog could sense the change in the air too. It was an unusual quiet, the calm before the storm, but Jack wasn't naive. He knew that the coming days would test every bit of his training, his resolve, and his ability to make calculated decisions under pressure. As he neared the outskirts of the city, he took a deep breath, letting the familiar scent of the urban landscape calm him, if only for a moment. It had been a long time since he'd been pulled back into a fight like this. The last time, it had been overseas, a world away. But now the stakes were personal. These people weren't just faceless enemies. They were families, communities, individuals trying to rebuild their lives after facing unimaginable hardships. Stopping at a red light, Jack glanced down at the folder once more. Inside, he found detailed maps of the area, names and connections. Every piece of intel Tanya had managed to gather. One name stood out, Daryl Kane. It was the name that kept cropping up across multiple documents. A man at the top of the chain, the one pulling the strings. A man who had built his empire on intimidation, terror, and control. Jack's fingers traced the name. Kane's name was attached to everything. The illegal shipments, the threats, the local businesses that had quietly surrendered to the Vipers. He wasn't just a thug, he was the mastermind, a puppet master controlling every move in the city. And if Jack was going to dismantle this operation, he needed to start with Kane. The next stop was clear. He had to find Kane's hideout. Max let out a small whine, his eyes fixed on Jack, sensing the tension in the air. Jack could feel it too. The closer they got to the heart of the Viper operation, the more dangerous things would become. But this wasn't just about justice. It was about stopping something that could destroy everything. He wasn't going to back down. As Jack arrived at a small diner on the outskirts of town, he parked his truck in the lot and took a deep breath. Tanya had mentioned a detective who might be able to help, someone who had been quietly investigating the Vipers from the inside, Detective James Greer. Jack wasn't sure what to make of the man, but with the kind of power Kane had, they needed all the help they could get. He looked at Max, who was already watching him intently, as if to say, "Don't worry, I've got your back." Jack smiled faintly at the dog, feeling a small flicker of reassurance. He wasn't alone in this fight. Inside the diner, the air was thick with the smell of fried food and coffee. It was a small, worn establishment, the kind of place where locals went to talk and share gossip. Jack's eyes scanned the room, finding what he was looking for in the back corner. Detective Greer sat alone in a booth, a cup of coffee in front of him, scribbling notes in a small notebook. Jack hesitated for a moment before making his way over. There was no turning back now. The battle lines were drawn. "Detective Greer?" Jack's voice was low but firm. The detective looked up, his eyes narrowing at Jack's approach. He wasn't sure what to expect, but when he saw the steady determination in Jack's eyes, he waved him over. "Sit," Greer said, his voice gruff. "I've been expecting you." Jack slid into the booth across from the detective, his eyes scanning the room for any potential threats. It wasn't a paranoid instinct, just a habit formed over years of training. Greer had a knowing look in his eyes, like he had seen this kind of situation before. "You're working on the Vipers," Jack stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Greer nodded, his face hardening. "Been trying to take them down for months. They've got their fingers in every pie. Politics, business, law enforcement, you name it. They're untouchable, unless we do something drastic." Jack pulled the folder Tanya had given him from his bag and slid it across the table. Greer picked it up, flipping through the documents quickly, his brows furrowing as he processed the information. "I've been gathering intel on them for months," Jack said, his voice steady. "But it's more than just a street gang. This is organized. We've got a network to dismantle." Greer looked up at Jack, his expression unreadable. "So you're the man who's been making waves. You've got guts, but this isn't a one-man show. Kane's got the power, and his people aren't afraid to kill anyone who gets in their way." Jack's eyes hardened. "I'm not afraid of him or his people." The detective met his gaze for a long moment before leaning back in the booth. "You think I don't know that? We've all seen what the Vipers are capable of, but what you don't know is just how deep they've buried themselves. If you're serious about bringing them down, you need to understand that this won't be easy. It's not just about taking out a few of their men. You've got to hit them at the heart of the operation." Jack nodded, his mind already formulating the next steps. The warehouse, the supply routes, the enforcers, they all led to Kane. "I'm going after Kane," Jack said quietly. "This ends with him." Greer's eyes flashed with something, a mixture of caution and respect. "You're not going to get anywhere near him alone. You'll need backup. But even then, you've got to be prepared for the fallout. These guys don't go down easy, and when they do, they don't go quietly." Jack's jaw tightened. "I'm prepared. I've been preparing for this my whole life." Greer sighed and slid the notebook across the table. "This is what I've got on Kane's operation," he said, his tone serious. "He's got a warehouse on the outskirts of town, near the old industrial park. It's heavily guarded, high security, but it's also the linchpin of everything they do. If we take that down, we take him down." Jack stood, his decision made. "Let's do it." Greer stood with him, his gaze meeting Jack's with a quiet intensity. "You know what you're getting into, right?" "I do," Jack replied, his voice low and resolute. "Then let's finish this," Greer said, a slight edge to his voice. Jack gave a small nod, his hand resting on Max's head as they left the diner. The next phase of the operation was about to begin. The night was quiet when Jack and Greer arrived near the outskirts of the industrial park. The lights from the nearby buildings cast long, shadowed streets. and the wind carried the faint hum of machinery from the warehouses in the distance. The area was dead at this hour. Most people had long since turned in for the night, and it was the perfect time to strike. Jack's truck rumbled as it pulled up to the edge of the gravel road, just outside the perimeter of the warehouse complex. Max was already alert in the passenger seat, his eyes focused on the shadows ahead, his body tense with anticipation. Jack's focus, however, was fixed on the task ahead, every muscle in his body aware of the danger looming in the dark. This wasn't just a raid. This was the beginning of something far larger, something that had the potential to dismantle the Viper's entire operation. Greer climbed out of the car, his face serious, his stance like a man who had been to war and knew what it meant to be prepared. Jack motioned for Max to stay, and the dog obediently settled into the seat, his gaze never leaving his master. They moved quickly, staying low as they approached the chain-link fence surrounding the complex. Jack's eyes scanned the perimeter, taking in the layout with military precision. He had already done his reconnaissance, and now it was time to put the plan into action. This warehouse was the hub of Kane's operation, where the shipments of guns, drugs, and cash were all stored and distributed. If they could take it out, they would cripple the Viper's ability to operate, but it wouldn't be easy. The warehouse was heavily guarded. "Stay close," Jack whispered to Greer, his voice low and firm. "We move fast, we move quiet." Greer nodded. "Understood. I've got your back." They crept around the perimeter, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the security cameras that dotted the area. Jack could hear the faint chatter of guards on the other side of the warehouse, the usual patrols. He had expected as much. The Vipers weren't fools. They kept a tight grip on their assets. As they neared the main entrance, Jack's mind raced, assessing their options. The main door was locked, and there were at least 2 guards stationed outside. He could see their figures moving in and out of the shadows as they kept watch over the building. Jack's eyes flicked to a smaller side entrance, half hidden by a stack of crates and shipping containers. It was a long shot, but it would give them the best chance to get inside without alerting the entire complex. "I'll take the right," Jack said to Greer. "You cover the left." Greer nodded and pulled out his sidearm, his grip tight but controlled. Jack crouched low and moved toward the entrance, his steps light and swift. The world seemed to slow down as he moved, his senses heightened. Every small sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of machinery, was a potential threat. But he didn't falter. This was his element. Reaching the side entrance, Jack glanced around the corner to check for guards. One was standing at the far end, his back turned. Jack's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. There was only one guard between them and their objective, and the chances of getting inside undetected were good, if they moved fast enough. In one fluid motion, Jack signaled to Greer. The detective nodded and moved into position. Jack took a deep breath, and with a soft exhale, he moved, gliding across the gravel toward the guard. The man didn't hear him approach, too focused on the faint sounds in the distance. In the blink of an eye, Jack was on him, a hand over his mouth, another twisting his arm behind his back. The guard let out a soft grunt, but didn't have time to react. Jack's training took over, a quick, silent takedown, and the man was unconscious on the ground. Greer moved in, his movements as smooth as Jack's. Together, they dragged the unconscious guard out of sight and into the shadows, securing him in a nearby storage shed. With that, they were in. The warehouse door loomed before them, reinforced steel and bolted shut. Jack took a moment to assess the lock, then turned to Greer. "Ready?" Jack asked, his voice low. Greer nodded, and Jack pulled a small toolkit from his bag. With practiced precision, he worked the lock, careful to avoid making a sound. Within moments, the door creaked open, revealing the inside of the warehouse. The pungent smell of metal, oil, and machinery filled the air, a sign that this place was the heart of the Viper's operations. Jack's eyes scanned the room, taking in the layout. He could see crates piled high, most of them covered in tarps. Guns, drugs, and cash. Everything was being stored here, waiting to be distributed. "We need to move fast," Jack whispered. "Kane's not far. I can feel it." Greer moved to the side, keeping a low profile as Jack led the way deeper into the warehouse. They stayed to the shadows, avoiding the security lights that flickered overhead. The soft shuffle of their footsteps was the only sound in the vast space. As they neared the back of the warehouse, Jack spotted movement. A guard was approaching, but this one wasn't alone. Two more were following behind him, talking softly. They had no idea they were about to be ambushed. Jack signaled to Greer, and the detective immediately took position, preparing to take down one of the guards. Jack readied himself. He was going to make his move first. With a sharp exhale, Jack stepped into the light for just a moment, making his presence known. The guards froze, their eyes widening in shock. But before they could react, Jack lunged forward, knocking the first guard to the ground with a swift strike. Greer followed immediately, taking down the second guard with a quick, controlled move. The third guard, realizing he was outmatched, reached for his gun, but it was too late. Jack was on him in a heartbeat, disarming him with a sharp twist and sending him crashing to the floor. "Nice work," Greer said, his voice calm, but Jack could hear the undercurrent of tension. They weren't out of danger yet. Jack didn't respond. His focus was on the door at the far end of the warehouse, the office. That's where Kane would be. The man was the mastermind behind everything, and Jack knew it was time to end this. They made their way toward the office, each step bringing them closer to their target. Jack's mind was clear now. This was the final push, the moment that would either bring everything crashing down or leave him exposed. As they reached the door, Jack turned to Greer. "Ready?" Greer nodded, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. "Let's do this." The door to Kane's office was reinforced steel, but Jack knew what was behind it. He could feel it in the air, the intensity, the weight of the operation. This was it. This was where it all came together. Jack signaled for Greer to stay back, and he approached the door quietly, his mind sharpening with every step. Max's presence was always in the back of his mind, a steady reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. But it wasn't just Max he was relying on now. It was his years of training, his ability to read the situation, and his unshakable focus. He pressed his ear to the door. The sounds inside were faint but unmistakable. Low voices, the shuffle of papers, and the faint clink of metal on metal. Kane was inside, likely reviewing the operations, mapping out the next moves, deciding who was going to take the fall for the violence that was about to erupt. It was a matter of when, not if, the Vipers would escalate. Jack took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. His hand reached for the handle, his fingers steady as he turned it slowly. The door creaked open, just enough for him to slip inside without making a sound. The office was dark, lit only by the faint glow of desk lamps, casting long shadows across the room. A large wooden desk sat in the center, papers scattered on it, a laptop open with multiple tabs flashing on the screen. And there, seated behind the desk, was Daryl Kane. The man was larger than Jack had anticipated. Broad shoulders, a hard jaw, and a gaze that could freeze you in place. Kane was a predator, a man used to controlling everything around him. He wasn't some small-time thug. He was the orchestrator of this entire operation, and he knew exactly what kind of power he wielded. When Jack stepped into the room, Kane didn't even flinch. He didn't look up immediately, his fingers still tapping idly on the keyboard, as if he hadn't noticed the intrusion. But Jack knew better. Kane had seen him the moment he entered, and the fact that he wasn't reacting was a sign of his control. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here, Pierce," Kane said, his voice low but dripping with venom. "I was wondering when you'd finally come out of the shadows." Jack's gaze was unwavering as he stepped closer, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm, but his expression calm. "I'm here to put an end to this. All of it." Kane leaned back in his chair, finally looking up at Jack, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "You think you can just waltz in here and take me down? You think you can stop what we've built? You have no idea what you're up against." Jack's eyes never left Kane. He could feel the weight of the man's arrogance in the room, but it wasn't enough to shake him. He had faced worse, far worse, and he had made it through. "I'm not here for your empire," Jack said flatly. "I'm here for the people you've destroyed, for the families you've driven out of their homes. You've been feeding off fear, Kane, and it's time for that to end." Kane's smirk faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You really think you can stop this?" he asked, his voice hardening. "You're just one man and a dog. You think that's enough to take down everything I've built?" Jack stepped forward, his voice steady, but carrying a weight of finality. "I've already taken down your men. I've already exposed your operation, and now I'm going to take you down." For a brief moment, Kane's eyes flickered with uncertainty. It was subtle, but Jack caught it. The tiniest shift in the man's posture, the faintest hesitation, the realization that maybe, just maybe, his empire wasn't as untouchable as he thought. But it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by an icy resolve. "You're making a mistake," Kane growled, standing from his desk. His hand went to the gun holstered on his hip, but Jack was faster. Before Kane could draw, Jack was already on him, his fist connecting with Kane's jaw in a sharp, decisive punch. The force of the blow sent Kane stumbling back, knocking over his chair. The shock on his face was immediate, but it quickly turned to fury. He lunged at Jack with the strength of a wild animal, swinging a punch that would have knocked most men out cold. But Jack sidestepped, his movements fluid, and countered with a hard knee to Kane's abdomen. Kane grunted, but he wasn't done yet. His hands grasped at Jack, trying to pin him against the desk. But Jack's training kicked in. He ducked, using the larger man's momentum against him, and threw Kane onto the floor with a controlled maneuver. The sound of the man crashing to the ground was loud, but Kane wasn't finished. He scrambled to his feet, a wild look in his eyes. "You don't get it, do you?" Kane spat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "There will always be someone else. There's no end to this." Jack's expression remained unchanged as he stepped closer, his gun drawn now. "There doesn't have to be anyone else. Not if I stop you." Kane's eyes flared with rage as he reached for his gun, but Jack was too quick. In one smooth motion, Jack pulled the trigger, the shot ringing out with a deafening crack that echoed through the empty office. The bullet hit Kane's hand, knocking the gun from his grasp. Kane cried out in pain, clutching his injured hand, but Jack wasn't about to let him get away. With a quick motion, Jack grabbed Kane by the collar and slammed him back against the desk. "This ends now," Jack growled, his voice cold and final. The door to the office slammed open behind them, and Jack spun around instinctively. Greer was standing in the doorway, his gun raised, but his face was filled with cautious concern. He had been right behind Jack, ready to support him, but Jack had already taken care of the situation. "You're done, Kane," Jack said, his grip tightening. "You're finished." Kane's face twisted with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "You think this will stop anything?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You can't erase everything I've built." Jack leaned in close, his voice low and firm. "Maybe not, but you'll never hurt anyone again." Greer stepped forward, his gun still aimed at Kane, as he approached with handcuffs. "He's right. You're going to prison, and this time, there's no way out." Jack stepped back, allowing Greer to secure Kane. The man was defeated, his arrogance shattered. He was no longer the puppet master behind the Viper's empire. The operation was crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of the network would fall. The sound of sirens grew louder as the police arrived at the warehouse, their flashing lights casting a surreal, almost ghostly glow across the industrial yard. Jack stood back, watching as officers swarmed the building, securing the perimeter and rounding up the remaining Vipers who hadn't already fled. They were the last vestiges of Kane's empire, scattered and broken now that their leader had been captured. Jack's chest rose and fell with each breath, but the weight of the past few hours pressed heavily on him. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the tide had shifted. The Black Vipers had been exposed, their network in shambles, and their leader was finally behind bars. Jack's work wasn't finished yet, though. This was only the beginning. Greer stood beside him, his expression unreadable, but there was a sense of quiet satisfaction in the detective's posture. Jack knew he had made the right choice bringing Greer into the fold. The detective was a man who understood the system and how to work it. He wasn't a hero, but he was a man who knew how to get things done, especially when it came to bringing down corrupt forces that most people thought were untouchable. "You did good," Greer said, his voice low as they watched the officers drag Kane away, handcuffed and subdued. "You've taken down the head of the snake, but this isn't over. You know that, right?" Jack nodded, his eyes never leaving the scene. "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "Kane's down, but there are people above him, people who think they're untouchable." Greer glanced at him, his face grim. The network runs deep. We've got evidence, sure, but Kane's just one part of it. We'll need more if we want to bring down the entire operation. Jack's mind was already racing, thinking about the next steps. He couldn't afford to let the pieces fall apart now. There was too much at stake. The families who had been driven out, the people who had suffered in silence. Jack wasn't going to let their suffering be in vain. He was going to make sure the system took action, and he wasn't about to let anyone sweep the evidence under the rug. "You've got the intel," Jack said, turning to Greer. "The rest of the system needs to see it. All of it." Greer's expression softened slightly. "It'll get there. You've made sure of that. But you're right. We've got to keep the pressure on. We need to make sure the right people see this, and that nothing gets buried." Jack's eyes flickered toward the police as they loaded Kane into the back of a van, his face twisted in anger and defeat. The man had built his empire on fear, manipulating others into submission. But in the end, it had all crumbled around him. The thought gave Jack a grim satisfaction, but there was still work to do. The fight wasn't over until every last one of Kane's associates was brought to justice. With a last glance at the officers securing the warehouse, Jack turned to walk back toward his truck. Max was waiting for him, his ears perked and his tail wagging lightly. The dog was always a reminder that Jack wasn't alone. Max had been with him through every battle, every dark moment, and together they had always found a way to overcome the odds. "Come on, boy," Jack murmured, scratching the dog's head as he climbed into the driver's seat. "We've got a long road ahead." Max jumped into the passenger seat, his sharp eyes never leaving Jack as he settled in. The truck rumbled to life, and the two of them drove away from the warehouse, leaving the chaos of the night behind. But Jack knew it wasn't over yet. There would be more to come. The rest of the Vipers' network was still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He reached for it, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Tanya Walker. "The story's out. Kane's arrest, the evidence, everything. It's blowing up and I'm making sure it goes wide. This is big, Jack. You've done it. But we both know this isn't the end. They'll be looking for a way to come back. And when they do, we'll be ready." Jack's jaw tightened as he read the message, his mind already turning to the next phase of the fight. He had exposed the network, but there was always the possibility of it regrowing, like weeds in a garden that had been torn apart. Kane might be locked away, but the others? They would regroup, and the people who still supported the Vipers would come for revenge. But Jack wasn't scared. He had dealt with threats like this before, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The fight for justice was never simple, and it wasn't always clean, but it was the fight he had chosen, the fight he would finish. Max's ears twitched, and Jack glanced at the dog as they sped down the road. He didn't have to say anything for Max to know what was coming next. They had faced worse odds before. They had always come out on top. "We'll finish this," Jack muttered under his breath. "For good this time." As the truck rolled through the quiet streets, the weight of the night finally began to settle in. Jack had stopped Kane, but the fight wasn't just about one man. It was about stopping an entire system of corruption, a network built on fear and manipulation. The world wasn't just black and white, but tonight, for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he had made a real difference. The work wasn't done, but Jack knew that no matter what came next, he would keep fighting. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and news reports. The raid on Kane's warehouse had made headlines, but Jack knew the battle wasn't over. As much as it felt like a victory, the system was still in motion, still turning, and if they weren't careful, the Vipers would find a way to regroup, to rebuild. Kane might be in custody, but there were other figures in the shadows, other men and women with their hands in the pockets of local politics, law enforcement, and business. Jack didn't need to be told that they were watching. He had made his presence known, and now they would come for him. They always did. Max was at his side, as he always was. The dog had become more than just a companion. He was Jack's anchor, his connection to a world that was often chaotic and uncertain. There were moments when Jack felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, but Max was a constant reminder that the fight wasn't just about justice. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. As Jack sat in his small home, looking over the map that had started it all, The phone on his desk buzzed. It was Tanya. The story's gone global. Every outlet's running it. Kane's lawyers are scrambling, trying to make it go away. But the evidence is airtight. The press is all over this. They've already got a few names in the mix. Big players in local politics. This is just the beginning, Jack. They won't give up easily. Jack exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the photo on his desk. It was a picture of his family, long gone now. He had lost too many people to violence and fear, but every step he had taken in this fight had been for them. For everyone who had been forced out of their homes, for the families who had endured the kind of terror he knew all too well. He had taken down Kane, but there was still more to do. The people behind the Vipers, the ones funding the operation, the ones pulling the strings, they weren't going to disappear just because Kane had been captured. The work was far from over, but Jack had never been one to shy away from a challenge. Max barked, pulling him out of his thoughts. Jack smiled faintly, scratching the dog behind the ears. "You ready for the next round?" he muttered to the dog, who wagged his tail in response. It was as if Max understood exactly what Jack was thinking, that this wasn't the end, but merely another step on a long road. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was Detective Greer. "We've got a break. A few of Kane's lieutenants have flipped. They're willing to testify, and the names they've given us are just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to need all hands on deck for this, but it's a start. We've got more leverage now. We take them down, piece by piece." Jack's mind immediately raced through the possibilities. The pieces were falling into place, but the system was still corrupt. Greer's words held weight. They had leverage, but it would take more than just one person or one case to bring down the entire network. "I'll be there," Jack replied, his voice firm. "We'll finish this." The days that followed were a blur of action. The evidence kept pouring in, and with each new piece, the Vipers' grip on the city weakened. Jack worked closely with Greer, passing on intel and following every lead. They were getting closer to the heart of the operation, and with the media spotlight on them, the Vipers' reach was starting to unravel. Tanya had kept her word, pushing the story wide. It had become impossible for the system to ignore. Politicians were scrambling to cover their tracks, businesses were distancing themselves from the gang's influence, and the public outcry had made it clear that this wasn't just some small-time crime spree. It was a network that had festered for far too long. The media blitz had forced law enforcement's hand. Investigations were launched. Kane's associates were rounded up one by one, each arrested or turned the state's witness. The pressure on the Vipers organization was immense, but Jack knew that even as the dominoes began to fall, there was always more to do. They had disrupted the operation, but the roots were still there, buried deep in the underbelly of the city. Greer met Jack one last time at a quiet diner in the middle of a rainstorm. The soft patter of the rain against the windows and the flicker of the old neon sign outside gave the place an eerie feeling. But it was the only safe place to meet, and neither of them was willing to risk a public appearance. "We're getting close, Jack," Greer said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "The higher-ups are getting nervous. We've got names, big names, people with connections in every corner of the city. We need to keep pushing." Jack opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages of names, addresses, and dates. There were people here that he knew, businessmen, politicians, even a few cops. The Vipers had managed to infiltrate almost every level of society, and now with Kane out of the picture, the system was finally starting to take notice. But Jack knew better than to believe it was all over. The people behind this, the ones funding the operation, they wouldn't go down easily. He had learned that much in his years of service. The system wasn't just broken, it was complicit. But the more they exposed, the harder it would be for the Vipers to remain hidden. "I'll be ready," Jack said, his voice cold and resolute. "I'm not going to stop until every last one of them is brought down." Greer nodded, but there was a shadow in his eyes. He knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about one gang anymore. It was about dismantling an entire system of corruption. And the more Jack dug, the deeper he would have to go. As Jack and Greer parted ways, Jack glanced down at Max, who was sitting quietly by his side waiting for the next move. The dog's eyes met his, unwavering, and Jack couldn't help but smile. Max had been with him every step of the way. and that unwavering loyalty reminded him why he kept going. "Let's finish this, buddy," Jack murmured, his voice steady and unyielding. Max's tail wagged, and they headed out into the storm together. They had come this far, and they wouldn't stop until the city was safe again. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The fight for justice wasn't just about taking down one man. It was about exposing the darkness and making sure that, no matter how deep it ran, the light would always find a way through.